Good evening, and a very, very warm welcome on a rather drizzly November evening to the Rupert Beckett Lecture Theatre here at the University of Leeds. And welcome also to everybody who's listening online or indeed watching this after the event. My name's Hazel Hutchison, and I'm the head of the School of English here at Leeds. And I'm just delighted to welcome so many of you to this inaugural lecture to celebrate the work of Professor Julia Snell. Julia is Professor of Sociolinguistics, and over recent years, she's really positioned herself as a key voice nationally in discussions about inequalities of race and class in education, especially as these are experienced in the area of language. Julia's work on accent bias focuses on what she calls the persistent and durable deficit-based ideologies about working class pupil speech that have long been in place in England's schools. Her work is based around the fundamental principle that everybody's voice matters, whether you're a university professor, an Ofsted school inspector, a primary teacher, or a 9-year-old from Sunderland, or a teenager from Leeds. You should be heard for who you are and what you have to say, not for what you sound like. Her work also provides some really compelling evidence for what a lot of good teachers sort of intuitively know already, that the job of the teacher isn't simply to instruct, but also to listen. Children, young people, and adults alike, we all learn best when we join in, when we participate, and when we're part of the dialogue. Learning's not a transaction, it's a collaboration, a partnership. Or as Aristotle said way back thousands of years ago, education is not the filling of a bucket, but the lighting of a flame. Julia's work persistently calls for systems and standards in education that create the conditions in which those flames can be lit, whatever region you come from and whatever social class you might belong to. Julia has authored or co-authored around 40 journal articles or book chapters and written 2 books, including Better Than Best Practice, Developing Teaching and Learning Through Dialogue, which was published in 2014 by Routledge. She's currently writing a new book called Spoken Language, Standards and Inequality in Education for Cambridge University Press. Her work's been funded by all kinds of interesting external people, including the Leverhulme Trust, the ESRC, the BBC, and the Higher Education Funding Council. She's also been an advisor to a parliamentary commission on oracy in 1994 and to the Higher Education Policy Institute and to Ofsted's National Lead for English. Her work on access bias with one of our other staff here at the university, Tomé Laredo, has informed new policies here in Leeds about how we think about accents in the classroom, and that work has also spread out to other universities in the UK. Julia's often invited to go and speak at big keynote events at conferences, and her reputation as an expert in this field has led to invitations to contribute expert analysis on the radio, on Radio 4, to Stephen Fry's English Delight, and also to Word of Mouth. She's been in The Independent, the Times Educational Supplement, The Conversation, and a range of other blogs and magazines. It's remarkably impressive how well her work is known, not just inside university sort of circles, but also beyond it. I'm only giving you a taste here of some of the remarkable things that she's already achieved. Julia is also a very generous and effective collaborator. She works really well with other people, often in partnership, because she knows that doing things with other people could sometimes get you going twice as far. She's also in our school a really popular, well-respected teacher. Students love her classes because she practices what she teaches about fully engaging students in their learning. She takes a really active role in the school, and she's held many sort of important roles around widening participation and also recently as our Director of Impact. So I was absolutely thrilled and delighted to see Julia's work recognised with this promotion to a personal chair to make her a professor. But I'm also sure that far from being the pinnacle of Julia's career, this is just the beginning of many more amazing achievements that lie ahead of her in the future. It's only a staging post to more exciting work to come. Her title this evening is Language, Diversity and Social Injustice, so I'm delighted to introduce Professor Julia Snell.
Thank you, Hazel, for such a lovely introduction. And thank you to everybody for being here, for everyone in the room, for everyone online. I really appreciate you giving me your time tonight for this inaugural lecture. Now, for those of you who don't know, and I wouldn't have known before I became an academic, an inaugural lecture is a public speech given by an academic to celebrate the milestone of being promoted to professor. Now, I've been to a few of these before, and everyone does it in a slightly different way. So when I started preparing for this lecture, I thought I might ask AI what they think makes a good professorial inaugural lecture. And this was the response. So a good professorial inaugural lecture is a compelling blend of personal reflection and academic presentation, making complex research accessible to a diverse audience. It should connect the personal to professional and be engaging, well-paced and memorable, while remaining formal enough for the occasion. Well, this certainly feels quite formal, right? And we certainly have a diverse audience. So we've got a big group of English A-level students and some Year 13 students as well. We've got my colleagues from the University of Leeds, colleagues from universities elsewhere in the country, other educational professionals, alongside my family and friends. It's quite overwhelming, actually, if I think about it too much, because I've never presented to quite such a diverse audience. In order to fulfill these other criteria, I'm going to aim to tell you the story of my research that skips over some of the detail and the theoretical background in the interest of being engaging and well-paced, but highlights the key issues that I've addressed with my research and why I think they're important. As the title of the lecture suggests, this is a story about the part language plays in the construction of inequalities and injustices, especially in educational contexts. But it's also a story about how we might challenge these injustices and push for change. So we're going to begin by considering why it is that some language practices, speakers and perspectives are valued in society while others are stigmatized, and what the consequences of this are for people. And here there will be a bit of personal reflection because this bit of a story links with my own personal biography. So have a look at the comments on screen, which were made by two students studying at university in the north of England, who were both also from the north of England. These comments were elicited in a survey conducted as part of a research project on accent bias in higher education that I've been involved in with my wonderful Leeds colleague, Hise Tomela-Rido. Over 600 students completed this survey, and of those students, 50% reported having felt at a disadvantage because of their accents in academic contexts, at least sometimes. The two groups most affected were students from the north of England, especially those who identified as coming from a working class background, and international students who hadn't learned English as their first language. Now, it's the first group that I want to focus on because I'm also from a working class community in the north of England, Teesside in the northeast to be precise. And I was the first of my family to go to university. So this is a group that I affiliate with. And it was striking to me that the students participating in this research from the north of England were reporting the same kinds of biases and insecurities that I had felt nearly 30 years ago. So like these students, I went to a university in the north of England, yet I felt othered by my northern working class accent and identity, especially in academic contexts. I felt I was surrounded by posh southerners in my seminars. That's how I would have identified them then, not now. But in relation to them, I felt like I sounded thick and common, and that had an impact on my confidence. I became really self-conscious about my working class accent and identity in a way that I just never had before. And as well as affecting my confidence, it also affected my sense of what career opportunities might be open to me when I left university. So I simply ruled myself out of following certain career paths, which includes academia, by the way. It was only several years later that I came back to academia after a stint as a chartered accountant post-university. That's a different story. So this comment here about going down the pit, referring to mining, really resonated with me. So I remember joking with a friend who was also from the north of England, who I think might be listening in online, that we might as well have been walking around campus wearing flat caps and carrying sacks of coal, because it's like That's what people saw when they spoke to us. There was this stereotypic persona associated with us and our ways of speaking. Now, as a sociolinguist, I know that Northern accents have long been linked with the industrial, working class and iconic local identities, such as the Northern miner or the Liverpool dock worker or the unemployed Geordie with his flat cap and whippets. These associations with manual labour and working class identity endure today, and they mean that Northern speech is often associated with being uneducated, unintelligent, uncouth, all attributes that appear as out of place in higher education. And yes, of course, things have changed since I was heading off to university in 1997, but it's clear from this survey that these cultural ideas still persist at some level for students today. So where do these cultural values come from, and why do they persist? To answer this question, we need to situate accent bias in higher education in relation to wider societal attitudes to language. Sociolinguists and social psychologists have been researching this for a long time. For example, researchers have asked participants to listen to various voice samples and then to rate speakers along a range of characteristics. So intelligence and educatedness on the one hand, and things like friendliness and trustworthiness on the other. And they found that the same accents tend to be rated low consistently across all of these ratings. These are often the accents associated with urban areas like Cockney, Glaswegian, and Brummie. Accents associated with minoritised ethnic groups are also consistently rated as low status. Sociolinguists like me would argue that these evaluations are not really about accent, but about the social connotations evoked by the accent. Connotations related to the area, which is perhaps associated with heavy industry, crime, unemployment, negative attributes, and associations with the people who live there. Regional accents don't all fare badly, of course. So some, like Geordie, the Newcastle accent, tends not to be rated highly for things like intelligence, but does score very well for things like friendliness, trustworthiness, sense of humour. So think of celebrities like Ant and Dec and that kind of persona that they project. A past Leeds professor, Katie Wales, reminds us in her book Northern Englishes that it has historically always been the case that against the negative images of the industrial north of England and northern speakers, there are the more positive stereotypes of the resilient northerners, hardworking and humorous in the face of adversity, blunt speaking and straightforward, friendly to strangers. They're working flat caps matching their flat vowels. They have no side. They are what they seem. The same research has shown that the accent that linguists call received pronunciation, or RP, what others might call BBC English or the Queen's English, speakers who use this accent are consistently rated highly for things like intelligence, ambition, and competence, more so than regional accents. Why? Well, received pronunciation has historically been associated with those who've enjoyed a privileged education and who hold powerful positions in the media, politics, civil service, centred around London, the nation's capital in the south. In other words, RP is associated with people who have power and status in our society. And because of that, the accent itself becomes associated with high status. And it's seen as embodying, just quite naturally, those attributes we associate with high status speakers, like intelligence and ambition and competence. But not necessarily by everyone, though. For some, that link with high status might be interpreted as posh and pretentious, like it was for me when I was at university. There were students from the south of England who made this point in the accent bias survey, telling us that they were stereotyped as posh and privileged because of their RP accent, even though they didn't come from a privileged background. And they felt that that disadvantaged them in certain social contexts. So what can we learn from this? Well, we can learn that the social meanings associated with a particular accent or way of speaking aren't fixed. I've experienced this myself. So when I was 13, 14, I spent some time living in the US. And over there, my Teesside accent, the accent that would later on being negative evaluated at a UK university was evaluated in the US as beautiful. People would literally stop me in the corridor and ask me to speak in a good way. They just wanted to hear me. Why? Well, in the US, when people heard me speak, they didn't associate it with an industrial town in the north of England, characterised by high economic deprivation. When they heard me speak, they heard a British speaker, and they associated my British accent with the royal family, an afternoon tea, with being very posh and proper. And so that's how they evaluated me, posh and proper, which was very strange to me at the time. So the point I'm making then is the way we evaluate language has very little, if anything, to do with language. Language acquires social meanings first, according to the ideas, feelings and beliefs people have about particular groups of speakers. And second, according to the ideas, feelings and beliefs people have about language. We might refer to these as ideologies. Put simply, language ideologies are beliefs which influence our own language use, and importantly, which influence how we perceive the language use of others. Typically, these beliefs are around what counts as good or bad English and who are better and worse speakers. Such beliefs appear to be obvious, just common sense, but in fact, they're constructed from particular socio-political perspectives, and that means they tend to favour some groups over others. A widespread ideology that influences how we evaluate language is standard language ideology. This is the belief that there exists just one correct or best way of speaking, a standard against which we can reliably measure the speech of others. Now, we're going beyond accent here, that is different modes of pronunciation, to include grammar and vocabulary, and the variety that people call standard English. Now, when we think about writing, we can give a pretty good account of what we mean by standard English, because it's being codified in dictionaries and grammar books, and it's used by major publishers. So we get a high degree of uniformity, standardization, in the texts that are published in English around the world. But when it comes to spoken language, which by its very nature changes according to speaker, context of use, and over time, it's very difficult to decide what constitutes a standard linguistically speaking. We just don't get that same degree of uniformity. This is why we often hear standard English being defined, not clearly in linguistic terms, but in social terms, as, for example, the language of the educated. Now, as with RP, the particular dialect that emerged as the spoken standard was the one associated with white, predominantly male, upper-class speakers from the southeast of England who had held prominent positions in society. In other words, it was the language of a particularly privileged group of speakers that came to be seen as the standard. But the history of how that happened tends to be erased, and we are led to believe that this way of speaking is just simply correct, that it's good English, and embodies quite naturally qualities like clarity, eloquence, educatedness. But there's nothing natural about any of that. That's the workings of standard language ideology, this really strong and widespread belief that there's only one best way of speaking. Standard language ideology has far-reaching consequences in educational contexts, which is where I focused my research. Here, the belief that there's only one correct way of speaking is bolstered by a sense that being able to speak so-called standard English is crucial to educational success and future job prospects. So this quote comes from Sean Harford, who's writing here on behalf of Ofsted, submitting evidence to a parliamentary inquiry called Speak for Change. And here he's making the case that many children enter earlier settings language impoverished, and that standard English is an instrument of social justice for them. Now, the notion that some children are language impoverished and they need to speak standard English in order to better themselves has a long history. The 1921 Newbolt report states that the child who does not learn standard English will experience a serious handicap in many ways, including in finding employment. This major report on the teaching of English says that teachers must fight against the powerful influence of evil habits of speech contracted in home and street, Because if a child is not learning good English, he's learning bad English and probably bad habits of thought. The report goes on to say that the first and chief duty of the elementary school is to give its pupils speech, and thus to make them articulate and civilized human beings. In doing so, it renders the working class children it describes not only as inarticulate, but as lacking any language at all, and not only as immoral, but as inhuman. Now, these ideas feel quite extreme, and of course we have to bear in mind that this report was written 100 years ago. However, these same assumptions still circulate today. My colleague Ian Cushion and I have looked at how these kinds of ideas circulate in Ofsted reporting. And I'll just pause here actually to acknowledge my colleague Ian, who's sitting over there, because collaborating with Ian over the last 5 years or so has not only been really productive, it's just been an absolute joy. So thank you, Ian. But back to our study. So the first thing we did was to look at inspectorate report to the National Archives in London, or I should say Ian did this, that's his hand in the photo. And we found in these documents lots of evaluation of children's speech. So there are a few examples on screen. I just want to draw your attention to the point that, like in the Newbold report, a purported lack of standards in speech is being linked here with poverty, lack of ability, lack of worth. To bring things up to date, we analysed a corpus of more than 3,000 Ofsted school inspection reports published between 2000 and 2020, and we searched for phrases that are indicative of language ideologies, things like speak properly, correct grammar, standard English. We found that some reports criticised teachers and schools for using non-standard English, while others offered praise to schools for explicitly prohibiting such speech. So, for example, a 2019 report said some adults have weak spoken standard English and grammar. Too many staff make errors in their standard spoken English when they teach. In some cases, this means that they model bad habits or teach incorrect grammar. So bad habits again. One report included how in the best lessons, teachers reference the need for standard English and students are provided with a list of banned words to remind them. And in another, a whole school policy was praised for almost eradicating the use of like, despite this just being a feature of evolving spontaneous speech. As a very wise 9-year-old child in a lead school once told me, sometimes you've got to think. For the inspectorate then, those who are perceived as speaking in standard English are equated with correctness, properness and high quality teaching, whereas the opposite was true for those using non-standardized English. Worryingly, we found that the most hostile comments made about pupils' language were in relation to schools serving low-income and racially minoritized communities, where pupils' language was stigmatized as deficient and lacking, just as in the Newbold report. Significantly, speaking standard English was often associated by Ofsted with higher ability, while those using non-standardized accents and dialects, again, predominantly those from low-income and racially minoritized backgrounds, were positioned as being less able, lacking in clarity, badly behaved, unwilling to learn, or confused. Now, the only connection between how someone is perceived to use language and how they're perceived in terms of their intellectual ability, their behaviour, their willingness to learn, is an ideological one. That is, it's based on preconceptions about particular groups of speakers, not on empirical evidence. But when an institution like Ofsted make these links, an institutional authority, they reinforce this long-standing assumption that working class and racialised children are lacking and require remediation. And these assumptions have consequences for children's experiences of schooling. When standard English is idealised as indicative of correctness, clarity and high ability, children who use non-standardised English, again, those predominantly from working class and racialised backgrounds, are often perceived as a problem. The purported solution is that these children should change the way they speak. Some schools have adopted formal procedures for monitoring children's speech and eradicating the use of non-standardised English. So there are some examples on screen of schools who have issued dialect or slang bans. These are the high-profile ones that kind of make it into media reporting. With these kinds of things, there's never really any indication as to why this particular set of features has been chosen and not others, but we do tend to see the same features recurring. And these are the same features that get mentioned a lot in Ofsted reporting and by other educational authorities. So the use of aid, for example, or we was, like is in there, starting a sentence with basically. In classrooms, we might then see explicit correction of these forms or other overt evaluation of pupils' language. And we're going to look at a very brief example in a moment that was recorded in a Year 5 classroom as part of a project that I was involved in 2008 with my colleague Adam Lefstein. So this was my first job after my PhD, and I really struck gold because Adam always treated me as a collaborator, never as his assistant. And I'll always be grateful for that and for what I learned from him. So Adam, I think you might be listening in online. I want to say thank you. And back to the example. So this is a Year 5 classroom, and they have just watched Aidan Gibbons' short animation, The Piano. After children have worked in pairs to come up with a word that describes the emotion in the film, and one of the children has just offered the word sad, and that's where this episode will start.
You put your hand up if you think he looks sad. Okay. Jimmy, why do you think he looks sad? What makes him look sad?
Because he ain't got a smile on his face.
He ain't got a smile on his face.
He has not got a smile on his face.
It's worth knowing that just about half a minute before this episode, the teacher had called upon Freddie to report on the words that he had written down to describe the emotion in the film. And he'd said, I've come up with one thing, but I don't think I'm going to say it out loud. When he then does speak on lines 5 to 6 of the transcript you can see on the screen, the teacher corrects his grammar through marked repetition of the non-standard form. And got a smile on his face. Now, Freddie immediately recognises the need to reformulate into standard English, and he can do that, no problem. But why was that reformulation necessary? Freddie's answer made sense, it contributed to the discussion. It also signalled that he was now willing to participate. Perhaps this kind of oral correction helps pupils better understand which forms they need to use in their writing. That's often how the focus on pupils' speech is rationalised. So, for example, the head teacher at a school in Teesside, who banned the use of local dialect in pupils' speech, explained that this initiative was responding to the demands of the National Literacy Framework, which asks children to write in standard English. Ian and I also found that Ofsted propagate this notion that if you correct pupils' speech, it will have benefits for their writing. And teachers we interviewed in Leeds really felt that their pupils' speech influenced their writing. And they said that that's why that they would correct their speech, at least sometimes. Now, the need for children to develop competence in written standard English is indisputable. That's an absolutely fundamental part of education, and I don't think anyone would disagree with that. But there is no evidence that the policing of speech will help children conform to the conventions of written standard English. On the contrary, research evidence suggests that the non-standardised forms children use in their speech don't have a big impact on their writing. In fact, some don't occur in their writing at all. And is one of these. So Ian and I analysed pupil work from the East London Primary School, from where we've just seen that recording. This was the work of 52 pupils across the whole school year, about 125,000 words. There was not one instance of and in that corpus. Likewise, when we looked at pupil work at a school in Leeds, again, there were no instances of and. These young people understand that and is a feature only of speech. It never occurs in writing. Now, some features of their spoken dialect grammar did occur in their writing, but these were relatively few and far between. So our overall finding was that if teachers are interested in developing pupils' command of written standard English, which of course they are, there's nothing really to be gained by correcting their speech. There are things to be lost though. These kinds of corrections can have negative consequences for pupils' confidence. So you might not have noticed, but Asha laughs during Mr. Robbins' correction of Freddie's speech in a manner that she suggests she's laughing at Freddie. Laughter, comments, disapproving looks, they're hard to resist. And sometimes we can end up internalizing negative evaluations of our own language and losing confidence in ourselves and our ability. In the accent bias in higher education survey, many students made direct links between negative evaluations of their speech and low self-esteem and confidence. The impact on students' confidence had a knock-on effect on their career aspirations, influencing which companies they would consider applying for jobs at. Some students said they simply struggled to picture themselves as a professional with an accent. Consequently, students reported feeling pressure to tone down or soften their accent, or speak in ways I normally wouldn't. So is that the answer then? For Northern speakers to speak in ways we normally wouldn't? Well, let me be really clear, and I'm sure you won't be surprised at my answer here, but I'm speaking especially to all of the A-level students in the room who are going to be in this position themselves quite soon, deciding which degree programs to choose and which career paths to follow. The answer is no, you shouldn't change how you speak, or at least no more than we all do naturally as we style shift from one situation to the next. Yes, of course, in an interview situation, we'd all use more formal speech and present our most professional selves. I'm speaking in a much more formal way now than I no doubt will when I'm having a glass of wine afterwards. But if you fundamentally change the way you speak to become a lawyer or to join some other profession where it feels like you have to conform to a particular model of speaking, adopt an RP accent, for example, then you're just reinforcing the idea that to be a lawyer, you have to speak that way, like a white middle-class man from the south of England. And then that's where we end up with these kind of comments, a student not being able to picture themselves as a professional with an accent. Secondly, and probably you'll find this more useful, recent research from academics working on the Accent Bias Britain project found that interviewers in the legal profession were able to override their accent biases to set them to one side when candidates were knowledgeable and spoke confidently. So you don't need to try and speak like someone else. You need to go into professional situations knowing your stuff and being confident in yourself. I should perhaps say at this point that at the University of Leeds, we've recently launched the All Accents Welcome campaign to celebrate the diversity of voices on our campus and to raise awareness about accent bias, spearheaded by my colleague Hisei, and based on our research. This is a space where we want you to be confident in yourself. But confidence can be eroded when there is too much scrutiny of young people's speech in education. Now, I don't blame teachers for this. There are quite a few teachers in this room. Some, like me, teach in higher education. Others are teaching in primary, secondary, further education. All of us are just people. We are people who live in the same society in which ideas about good and bad language use are ingrained. Also, our language is subject to the same kinds of evaluations. So the quotes that you're going to see on screen now come not from my research, but from a recent teacher TAP survey, which shows that teachers are also subject to accent bias. And this can have serious professional consequences. So they also feel pressure to change their accent. And they're certainly aware of Ofsted's views on this. In addition, school teachers are being positioned by educational policy and accountability measures to hear children's language as either good or bad. Ian and I have argued that the reason non-standard speech is perceived as a problem in schools, including in relation to writing, is because authorities like Ofsted repeatedly tell teachers that it is a problem. And they tell teachers that they would be doing a disservice to their pupils if they don't correct their speech, because speaking standard English is held up as the key to social mobility. So remember Sean Harford's statement when he called standard English an instrument of social justice. And here's an excerpt from an Ofsted report on literacy, where they make clear that policing non-standard speech is being done in the interest of marginalised students. So they say, in another inner city school, serving a high proportion of pupils known to be eligible for free school meals, staff paid close attention to the difference between standard and non-standard English in spoken language. Pupils were quick to correct themselves when they used words such as ain't and gotten in their speech when responding to questions from teachers. They explained to inspectors how teachers and assistants taught them to use standard English by reminding them constantly during conversations and in lessons. Reminding them constantly in conversations and in lessons. I wonder how that feels. And I wonder what impact that has on the interactional dynamics in the classroom. That leads me on to another strand of my research, which is focused on classroom interaction and talk intensive, or what I'm calling dialogic approaches to teaching and learning. So what do dialogic approaches to teaching and learning involve? Well, in brief, and I'm oversimplifying, but teachers elicit a range of pupil ideas by asking open and authentic questions. And in doing so, they bring multiple and potentially conflicting perspectives into play. Teachers probe pupil responses, pushing them to extend and clarify their thinking. In turn, pupils listen to the teacher and to each other, and with their teacher's support, they build on, challenge, or clarify others' claims and offer alternative approaches. Now, when pupils participate regularly in this kind of classroom discussion, research suggests that they will internalise the processes of questioning, clarification, justification as habitual ways of thinking. This is why pupils who experience this kind of classroom talk don't just end up understanding the subject matter under discussion in more detail, be it science, English, maths. They develop broader capabilities to process, reason, and solve new problems. Capabilities that they can then put to use in other subjects, indeed in other aspects of their lives. And there are other benefits too. Pupils who experience dialogic teaching and learning will develop their oral language skills, gain confidence, and build relationships because they're becoming more patient and attuned to others' perspectives. They'll develop argumentation and public speaking skills and come to understand norms of rational deliberation. Now, in order to ensure that everyone can participate in dialogic classroom discussion, and thus that the benefits are distributed equitably, it's important that students are allowed to respond, question, challenge, and explain their thinking using whatever language they find most comfortable. There's no reason why this thinking out loud has to be done in standard English. For most of us, it'll be done in our local dialect. For pretty much all of us, it will involve some hesitation and the occasional use of like. The focus should be on the substantive content of children's contributions, the quality of their thinking, not on the forms of speech they use. When teachers create this kind of open and inclusive environments, virtually everyone participates. But if schools take a zero tolerance approach to non-standardized speech, banning it in the classroom and encouraging teachers to correct pupils' spoken language, they risk creating an environment in which pupils feel less confident in oral expression and thus less likely to contribute to classroom discussions. And these pupils will miss out on the dialogic exchanges that are so important to their learning. I've investigated other factors too that might inhibit dialogic teaching and learning in the classroom. like the pressure of preparing for standardised tests, which inevitably weighs heavily on teachers. So if you're a year 6 teacher and you're preparing your students for the SATs, you're probably not going to focus on talking, thinking, developing ideas together, because what you need them to be able to do is to answer a set of test questions, which always just have one right answer. Another challenge that I've thought about recently, and that I was able to explore as part of a Leverhulme Research Fellowship, relates to the kinds of assumptions and expectations educators have about pupils and how this affects what happens in the classroom. So some time ago, Adam Lefstein and I investigated teachers' perceptions of pupils' ability and how that might influence classroom interaction. Some of the teachers we worked with felt that lower ability pupils just weren't really capable of participating in dialogic teaching and learning. And we found that this played out in classroom interaction. So typically teachers would ask kind of easier questions to the perceived low ability pupils and reserve the cognitively demanding questions for those perceived as high ability, which meant in a sense that only some pupils, the higher achievers, were participating in that cognitively rich discussion. I then started thinking about how teachers' views about pupils' social backgrounds might impact what happens in the classroom. So the quote that you can see on screen is from a teacher in a school serving a socioeconomically disadvantaged community. And what we've been seeing here is the idea, again, that students from this kind of community have limited language skills. Now, as we've seen today, this isn't the view of just one teacher, and I'm not trying to say that this teacher is at fault or that she doesn't know her pupils, because of course she does. But what I've always tried to explain in my research is why a teacher might hold this view very deeply, and why and how it might play out in the classroom, what consequences it might have. So even just in the space of this talk, we've seen how these views are propagated by Ofsted, and they go back at least 100 years to the Newbold Report. They go back a lot further than that too. This idea that children from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds have deficient language has been around for a really long time. It's widespread. And I was interested in how it might play out in the classroom. So to investigate this, I drew upon some data I collected in 2 schools up in Teesside. I'm not going to say very much about that fieldwork. Essentially, I spent 1 day per week in the year 4 classroom and then followed this group of pupils into year 5. And I recorded the students using a lapel radio microphone, like the one I'm wearing. So it captured their interactions right throughout the school day. Now I'm going to focus only on one of these schools, which was situated in one of the most deprived areas of the country. There was very little pupil talk during whole class discussion in this school. In fact, pupil talk was somewhat discouraged. And consequently, pupils played a relatively passive role in their learning. Why was this the case? Well, amongst the teachers, there was a sense that the pupils who came from a socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds were immature or lacking in ability, or both, and that therefore, in order to help them, that they required carefully structured lessons in which their own input was kept to a minimum. However, because I was recording the children using a radio microphone, I picked up conversations happening outside of whole class discussion, interactions that flew below the teacher's radar, and these revealed a different picture of the children. So I'm going to share a short example with you that occurred in a religious education lesson when the pupil that I'm calling David was wearing the radio microphone, and they've been set a writing task, which is quite heavily prescribed. There's not particularly any room for independent thinking or discussion. But as the children are working on it, this discussion breaks out.
Who believes in God? Who believes in Jesus? Guess it's only you on this table who believes in God and Jesus. Yeah, because I never heard that. Probably do, but I know I do. Who made the world? The world was always there. Nobody created the world. There's never been a beginning, there'll never be an end. I was the world. And I was good. Yeah. So how can he be real if nobody knows how he's made? People don't he can't be real.
Finish the sentence you are on. Ari looks in the middle of the table. We may get a chance to finish this later.
Yeah, but Liam, how do you know that the Bibles are real? Do you think someone's just made them up? Then Jesus.
Differences of opinion emerge of this interaction, and the children introduce different sources of evidence in support of their claims. Joanne's reference there being a beginning evokes text from the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heaven and earth. Harry, on the other hand, demands empirical evidence. He needs to see to believe. The children pose authentic questions like Harry's, how was God made? Which is taken up by David and Joanne, and it actually prompts Joanne to reconsider her original assumptions. The children elaborate and build on previous contributions, and in doing so, they start to converge on an integrated line of inquiry. They are clearly thinking out loud and developing their thinking through dialogue. We can only imagine where this might have gone if it had been part of whole class discussion with a teacher there to probe their thinking. The conversations like these, captured by the radio microphone, reveal an alternative view of the pupils at this school. These children were capable of dialogic discussion and serious engagement with the lesson topic, but adults in the school seemed rarely to hear this kind of talk from the pupils because whole class discussion was controlled by teachers who elicited brief and structured pupil responses. Now again, my aim here is not to critique the teachers at this school or at any school. The teachers at this school were warm, welcoming, caring, committed. They cared deeply about their pupils. This was an Ofsted outstanding school. It did very well in SATs, considering that the pupils were categorised as below expectations when they entered. The teachers clearly felt the pressure of maintaining those results. It was something that they spoke about a lot. And they also felt the pressure of curriculum coverage. So the class teacher told me, it's a nice class this, but the trouble is I'm full pelt because I just have to get through the stuff. I'd love to be able to play with them a bit more, but you can't. So again, the point is not to critique teachers, but to show how the pressure of standards and testing combines with widespread assumptions and expectations related to children from socioeconomically deprived areas to limit opportunities for dialogue. That disadvantages these children, even though, of course, that is not the intention. This is why it is so important to challenge these assumptions. I can give you lots of examples that show that children from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds are, their language is not limited and deficient. So it was a key finding of my PhD research, which focused on children's language variation, that the working class children I worked with already used standard English forms. It's just that they use them alongside their local dialect and other forms considered non-standard. And significantly, I found that they were strategic in how they selected linguistic forms, considering their interactional goals and the kinds of effects they wanted their language to have. So to give you an example, one form that stood out to me was the use of possessive me. So I was quite interested in their grammar. That is the use of me for the first person possessive determiner, where standard English would have my. Now, possessive me is a noticeable feature of the local dialect. It's one that gets commented on. And some people would say it's incorrect grammar because it feels like the speaker is using the object form me for the possessive function. But that's not the case here. The children didn't always use me. In fact, most of the time they used the standard form my, or a phonologically reduced version like ma. Possessive me was actually relatively infrequent. And what that meant was that I could look at every single instance of it in context. And this was something that researchers interested in grammatical variation hadn't typically done before. What I found was that every one of the me forms used by the children conveyed a special interactional meaning. And I'm going to give you an example. This occurred when 10-year-old Neil was wearing a radio microphone in the playground while refereeing a game of football.
Get off! Oh, right, you still have that on. Just dug the electrical equipment, yeah? I'm ready. Yeah, man! Hey, yeah, I'm a sheriff fan. You weirdo! Get back! I am! 100 bullets! 100 bolts! Go through my finger! Pain, agony, electrical current! Ow! The electrical current! This electrical current's burning.
So the electrical equipment that Neil is referring to here is the radio microphone that I've asked him to wear. And I would like to reassure everyone in this room, especially anyone who sits on the University of Leeds Research Ethics Committee, that the radio microphone did not give out agonising electric shocks. Neil's utterance in lines 13 to 21 is meant as an entertaining performance for his friends. And the pinnacle of that performance involves possessive me, 100 volts going through my finger. In addition to numerical exaggeration, 100, the lexical slip between bullets and bolts, and Neil's attempt to dramatically lexicalize the pain, agony, electric currents, which reaches a crescendo in the emphatic lengthened ow. Now, this fleeting performance leaves those in hearing distance to ponder whether Neil really means what he's saying, or whether he's exaggerating or making it up completely. This distancing effect between the speaker and the truth of the utterance was common to all of the examples involving possessive me. This form was used when the children wanted to present themselves as somewhat detached from what they were saying, adopting a mock serious or jokey stance. Now, of course, that stance wasn't achieved only by using me instead of my. Their performances combined possessive me with shifts in volume and pitch, lengthened vowel sounds, laughter, emphatic stress. But variation between the standard and non-standard form was absolutely part of this. And if we had more time, I could give lots of other examples. But we all exploit language variation in this way, making linguistic choices according to the context, who we're talking to, what we're trying to achieve. It's in this sense that language is a resource. Why on earth would we want to get rid of that resource? And honestly, we can't get rid of it. God knows education has tried over many years. We can't get rid of it because these non-standard forms are not just markers of regional pride and community identity, though of course they absolutely are, and that is incredibly important. But in addition to that, they're also interactionally very useful. And that means that children aren't going to stop using these forms just because their teachers tell them to. Instead, it's important that we recognise children's linguistic ingenuity in making purposeful linguistic choices and help them feel proud of that, not ashamed of their speech or where they're from. I'm going to start trying to bring all of this together. So in summary, the language of children from less privileged socioeconomic backgrounds is often described in terms of absences, limitations, and deficiencies. Interventions designed to modify their speech and promote standard English are therefore justified as a means of helping these people advance under a social justice agenda. The promise is that standard English will grant access to educational success, the job market, and upward social mobility. As part of this agenda, teachers face pressure from a range of policy and accountability measures to police their own and their pupils' speech. My research has challenged the view that working class children's language is deficient. The children I have studied have shown themselves to be savvy in their language use. They use salient features of the local dialect to construct different stances and identities and interaction. Importantly, they also use the standard form, purposely selecting the most relevant form according to their interactional goals. And we all have this amazing capacity to exploit language variation in order to achieve what we want to do in interaction and to style ourselves linguistically in multiple different ways. So rather than trying to erase local dialects and other forms deemed non-standard then, it's much more productive to think about extending children's linguistic repertoires to include a whole range of resources. This involves understanding and valuing the language children bring to school. At the same time, it also involves explaining to young people how and why, in some areas, in formal presentation or if they're going for a job interview, they may well be judged against an idealised standard which is deemed correct and the best form of English solely through its association historically with powerful people. I've also challenged the notion that speaking standardised English will lead to upward social mobility. I believe this to be a myth. I argue instead that measures that promote standardised English in speech and denigrate non-standardised speech simply reinforce the notion that speaking correctly means emulating the speech of white and economically privileged speakers. This will benefit white and economically privileged speakers much more than it will ever benefit those less privileged children that educators work so hard to support. In addition, stigmatised speakers may find that modifying their speech doesn't really have the benefit that they want it to have. So educational linguists in the US, in particular Nelson Flores and Jonathan Rosa, have shown that the language of Black and minoritized students is routinely stigmatized for failing to adhere to standardized English, even where they use language considered standard when produced by privileged white speakers. In order to explain this, they argue that our perceptions of language are filtered through what they call ratio-linguistic ideologies, which privilege certain kinds of speakers and marginalize others, regardless of the language they use. And we're going to see an example of this. So this means that we really need to shift our attention away from speakers' language use and towards listeners' perceptions, considering how beliefs about race, class, gender, and sexuality influence our perceptions of what we hear. So my research is focused predominantly on social class, but we have to acknowledge that class intersects with all of these other identity categories. This was something students in the accent bias in higher education survey drew attention to. So I won't read these quotes out, I'll let you look at them yourself. But what you can see in these students' comments is a tacit acknowledgement that different identities intersect or inform each other. This is what academics refer to as intersectionality. And also that it's about more than identity, it's about power and marginalisation. It's about how some people are multiply marginalised while others are multiply privileged, and thus how people are more or less vulnerable to accent biases. And here actually I want to give a shout out to my colleague Lucy Jones, who writes about intersectionality in such fantastic ways. So what we can see here then is that it's one thing to have a working class regional accent, but it's quite another to have a working class regional accent and be a Black woman or a gay man. That creates a substantively different experience. Now, I want you to notice that the woman who self-identifies as BAME, Black, Asian and minority ethnic, states that she changed her accent to reflect that of her university peers, but people still noticed and commented on her accent. So even when she changed her way of speaking, it didn't lead to greater recognition of her academic abilities. This is the point that Nelson Flores and Jonathan Rosa are making, that listeners' perceptions are shaped not just by what they hear, but by what they see. And if what they see is a Black woman, then they may still perceive her language as non-standard or deficient, regardless of the language she's actually using. In the same way, working class children can change how they speak, but this doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be perceived differently or that the doors of opportunity will suddenly swing open. This is because judgments about language are not really about language. They're about speakers and their relative status in society. So we have to tackle the root causes of language prejudice, which are grounded in hierarchies of class and race. Asking individual speakers to change the way they speak does nothing to address these underlying prejudices. It just places unfair pressure on speakers who are already marginalised. Why should some children and not others endure the cognitive burden of changing how they speak in order to participate in classroom discussion? What if they can't or won't? What if they get embarrassed and withdraw? Well, then they're missing out on opportunities to participate in the kind of dialogue that will help them shape and refine their thinking. Dialogic teaching and learning, that's an approach that has been proven to be beneficial. If they miss out on that, then we're holding them back from achieving their potential. That stifles social mobility. In terms of the way forward, we are at an interesting and exciting time for spoken language in education because the Curriculum and Assessment Review has just published their final report, and in it, oracy, which is the term they use for spoken language, is writ large. So we can expect changes in education that will recognise spoken language or oracy as foundational to schooling alongside reading, writing, and mathematics. And I absolutely welcome this. But as I continue in my research, I will push for socially just approaches to oracy education. It is really important that oracy education does not become a targeted intervention designed to support working class or marginalised students to adopt the language practices of a privileged few. The aim instead has to be for all teachers and pupils to develop critical awareness about spoken language and challenge injustice, and for schools to embed dialogic teaching and learning in their classrooms. I'm going to be working with primary school teachers on socially just approaches to oracy and to create resources that can be used in the classroom. So if you are a primary teacher or if you know primary teachers who might want to be involved in that work, please get in touch. I'm hopefully also going to be working with my colleague Ian to advance futures of linguistic justice in collaboration with secondary school teachers. But for now, I'm going to end with a call for all of us to focus much less on how people speak and much more on developing new and productive ways of listening. Institutions can and should have a policy on this, one that makes clear our responsibilities as listeners within educational spaces or within other communities and workplaces where we might regularly encounter people who speak differently from us. As individuals, we can all do our bit to listen attentively and with more care and compassion. You have certainly all been very attentive listeners. I feel like I've really milked this opportunity and I've spoken for a long time. And I thank you wholeheartedly for listening. I'm not sure that we'll have time for questions. If not, I would urge you to please keep in touch. You can get in touch with me via email or social media. I would also love it if you would scan the QR code or follow the link to give me feedback, make comments, ask questions. There's a space on that online form where you can add your name and email address, your contact details, if you want to keep in touch and continue the dialogue about these issues. But for now, thank you so much for listening. Thanks to Matt and Ellie for organising. And huge thanks to all my colleagues, family and friends for all of their support. Thank you.